Hello, hello. I'm Danita Jones. Some of my family members call me Civic Minded Jones. And I'm so excited today and happy to have Steven J. Niven. He is an executive editor at Harvard University's Hutchins Center for African and African American Research. Henry Louis Gates is the executive director of that program. And Steven directs the story section of enslaved.org, a digital humanities project at Matrix, Michigan State University. He is the author of Barack Obama, A Pocket Biography of Our 44th President. You know, you should take a look at his biography. He has a long list of awarded accomplishments. So let's give a big welcome to Stephen. Yay! Thank you, Stephen, for being here.
Well, thank you for inviting me, Danita. It's, yeah, it's good to be here. I have to say, I believe that we met when you through um, I forget how we met, but
Yeah, I can tell you how we met.
you wrote a biography for enslaved.org about
Yes.
Peter Crosby, a Mississippi Reconstruction politician, and I also have worked on biographies on Mississippi politicians and Reconstruction eras. So so I think we connected on that, right?
We did. And if initially it was with regarding that the postmistress, we were trying to figure out, or I was trying to figure out who this woman was, and I actually I will add up her picture because maybe by doing this, someone may even know more about her because I know we've been on a hunt for who this black woman was in the 1800s that were in the Congress, the picture for Mississippi. And so we're like, because we never see women in those particular photos. So, and then you start seeing my work on Substack, where I was talking about Peter Crosby, and you invited me to be a contributor, and I was really grateful and happy to be a part of your enslaved.org.
Right. Yeah. So yeah, that was exactly how we met. And uh, I mean, I guess maybe I can say a little bit more about the postmistress. So
Hmm.
her name was Adie Bell, and so most state governments probably did this, but Mississippi certainly did. And there was all of the state legislators, the House of Representatives, and or the state House and the state Senate for Mississippi. So every single individual had a photograph of them, and it was all arranged so you could see them all in one place. Although I think they were individual photographs, and maybe there were like
Yeah,
150.
I think they're individual photographs, but all
Yeah.
placed in that one particular document.
Them all on a poster, and you look and it's striking because it's Mississippi in 1874 or 1875, and there are a fairly large number of African American representatives and senators. And so that is significant, that is interesting. But of course, they're all male because it's 1874 and 75, and women can't vote. But then you found it that there was a woman on there. Her name was Adie Bell. And was she black? Was she white? It was sometimes it's hard to tell just from a
Hmm.
photograph. But we think pretty sure that she is an African American, and she was the post mistress or postmaster for the actual legislature in Jackson, Mississippi. And so
Yeah.
we wondered who she was and could we find her, and we haven't found her yet. But one of these days, we might be able to find this, you know, example that that African American women were also involved in um,
And
Reconstruction.
government, yeah, and during
Government.
Reconstruction, yeah.
Uh,
And I thought that was so interesting and loved how you and I connected. And then there's a woman as a Mississippi librarian that also really actually I think that's maybe how she introduced us, or you found me on Twitter when it was Twitter back in the day. So, but anyway, but I'm so happy you're here. But I want to dive into this, and before we do, your work really centers around, African American, the whole diaspora of Africa. Why, and let's address the elephant in the room. You're white, you're Scottish, and I know people can hear your accent. Why is this work important to you?
well, I guess start at the very beginning, I guess the very beginning of my interest in African American history. I mean, I guess, you know, you pick up little things here and there, but really the main thing was I was a student in Scotland, and my just had finished my second year at Edinburgh University in Scotland, and there was an exchange between 15 Edinburgh students could go study at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia, and 15 students from Penn were able to go to Scotland. So, so we switched, and so instead of having my third year in Edinburgh, I spent my third year in Philadelphia. And this is fall of 1986. And I get there, and there's a whole bunch of classes that I don't look very good. But I had to add one more history class. So I said, okay. And I found there was this class being offered, I think by a professor who was teaching there for the first time. And it was called Black Women in America. And I thought, well, I'm not black, I'm not a woman, I'm not even an American, but if I want to understand this country, I think I knew enough then that that would be the class that would like open up a lot more about it than just like a general US history class or even just an African American history class. And I was interested in women's history too. So, not knowing much, I uh, took the class. It was offered by a woman named Evelyn Brooks, who got her dissertation from University of Rochester, which is actually where I am right now. I'm now in Rochester, New York. Um, but as Evelyn was teaching the class, it was a very small class. All my classmates, apart from one, were African American. And I just, not only did I learn a lot, but it changed my life because I certainly didn't think I was going to be studying history. But through working with Evelyn, who's now Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham, and who became, I believe, the first tenured African American woman professor in the history department at Harvard. She's still there and an amazing scholar. Uh, so I learned so much from her, and then from her husband, who was a federal judge and also a historian, A. Leon Higginbotham, uh, who should have been on the Supreme Court, but politics didn't work that way. So I learned a lot from both of them, studied at grad school in North Carolina, and then came back. And then Evelyn by now had moved to Harvard. So she and Skip were working on a project, the African American National Biography. They're the co-editors, and they said, oh, would you like to work on this project? So I said yes. So that was in 2002. And so the African American National Biography was very ambitious. It wanted to be and is the largest biographical dictionary of African Americans from, the very first people who arrived in Virginia, one of whom we might talk a little bit about later, right up to the present day, including Barack Obama. And as a little sidebar, when President Obama was elected, just as he was elected, or even just before he was elected, I was asked to write a short, mini biography of him. Obviously, only getting as far as the election itself, which I did and was published. And it's a tiny little book, but it's online, and I think it's a good introduction to him. But so that was 1986 that I began. Since then, one way or another, I've been working in African American, studying African American research. And then, so the African American National Biography was completed in 2008. And then, okay, now what happens? I guess got to find another job. But fortunately, Professor Gates was working on another project with African professor at Harvard, the Dictionary of African Biography. So the same principle, short biographies of important African people, but this time going back to from the ancient Egyptians to the present day.
Mhm.
Um, so we worked on that for a couple of years, published it in 2011, 2016. It's over, but we start the Dictionary of Caribbean and Afro-Latin American Biography. So same project, but uh, people who were in the Caribbean of African descent, people who were in Latin America. of African descent. Um, so these are all, and I wrote some, I guess I wrote maybe 150 in total of all of them, but mainly my role was as an editor, a project manager. You get the editors to do stuff, you try and get writers to do stuff. So that was what I did. And then since then, I've been working on different projects. One of which is very new, and that's called the Oxford Dictionary. It's again with Oxford University Press, the Oxford Dictionary of African American English, which is modeled on and works with the Oxford English Dictionary. So I'm like the research manager for that. So that's and again, Professor Gates is the editor in chief of that. So I've been working on that. We worked on a project using the movie Selma by Ava DuVernay to teach high school and middle school students about civil rights. So we actually got the film and the rights to the film to use clips. And from that, students would learn about the civil rights movement in America, but especially on voting rights using, clips of the film. Worked on another project which looked at the Roosevelts, Franklin and Eleanor, and the relationship to African Americans, both in terms of civil rights. She was very pro civil rights. He was kind of less so, but together they both advanced African American civil rights, but also the relationship with African Americans who were their servants as well.
Mhm.
So, so a whole bunch of different projects, but I guess the common thread is people of African descent. I guess the other common thread is that usually it comes in the form of a biography. So we're talking about individuals. So I'm not one of those historians who are, writing things grounded in theory or whatever. It's the lives that were lived, and I think let the lives speak for themselves. So it's what I do is a bit strange when people meet you and they say, "Oh, what do you do?" And
Mhm.
they say, "Oh, they're a plumber or a teacher or
Mhm.
something," and I say, "Well,
Mhm.
this very light-skinned
Right.
studies, but
Right.
I don't know, I wouldn't do anything else.
Right.
I'm forever happy that I walked into that classroom and met somebody as giving as Evelyn was, who said, of course, why would I have any problem with a Scottish person wanting to learn this? Everybody
Right.
should learn African American history and the rest of US history too. But if your education in US history doesn't have any African American aspect to it, then you're missing a lot, and you're not going to understand.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I know growing up, there
Particularly,
was very little in the school books about, our history. We would
yeah,
study about slavery and then civil rights, and that's pretty much it. And I didn't begin my love of history until I was in college when I had an African American course. And once I
yeah,
knew more about my own history, then I started being really engaged in other people's history. And so it really empowers you when you actually know your own history, or more in a fuller sense. So I asked you here today because, you know, I've been working on studying and writing about Reconstruction. And I noticed a pattern and regarding how white supremacists, tend to really rear their ugly heads when Black people get in power. And I first noticed it when even before Barack Obama was elected. I saw the Tea Party manifest, and then I was like, "Oh my goodness, here we go." Reconstruction era. It really tied into that. And we've been seeing it keep evolving, keep growing bigger and bigger. And so I wanted to ask you, how has, the presence of Black political leaders, historically, no, actually, before we go into that, let's talk about the history of political backlash.
okay. Sure. So as a term, I did a little bit of research on this because and found that my original thinking wasn't quite right. So in terms of the term backlash or white backlash, There's a song by Nina Simone called Backlash Blues
Mhm.
that was written by Langston Hughes. And
Mhm.
then she recorded it. And if you've seen Questlove's Summer of Soul, she
Yes.
sings it.
It was a great documentary.
One of the most amazing documentaries. Uh, did you know that Questlove was descended from the last slave ship to arrive in America?
No, I did not know that.
I just learned this recently. It was on Finding My Roots to talk about Professor
Okay.
King, but yeah, he was. Anyway, but if you watch of Soul and you see Backlash Blues, uh, Nina's, it's a song that, as I say, Langston Hughes wrote in 66 or 67. And what they're referring to there is the immediate reaction to the passage of the Voting Rights Act in 1965 and the Civil Rights Act in 1964, which essentially, achieved finally in August 1965 with the passage of the Voting Rights Act. I would say America can finally say, oh, we're a democracy. We've maybe been saying it for a long time, but now America really is a democracy because there are um, laws in place that say, you can't discriminate against somebody voting on the basis of race.
Hmm.
So America became a democracy not in 1776 or 1865, but in 1965, just before I was born in 1966. But in 1966, there was a congressional election. So the first elections that take place after the passage of the Voting Rights Act. And now some things don't change. The Democrats are still in charge in the House and the Senate. And of course, at this point, many Republicans are, just to be clear, many Republicans are also supporting expanded civil rights for African Americans. And still a significant number of Democrats in the South are opposed to it. But so there's bipartisan support for this. But in the 66 election, people noticed that Democrats lost quite a lot of seats. Now, was this about Vietnam, or was it about civil rights? And you kept on seeing more and more phrases saying, "Oh, this is a backlash, a white backlash." The first example I can see of somebody talking about backlash to civil rights was actually in 1963, just before Kennedy died, and before even the Civil Rights Act was passed,
Hmm.
before the Voting Rights Act was passed.
Right.
It talked about Chicago, which I think you said you were from
Yeah, I'm
Chicago,
from Chicago.
and it was talking about Polish American backlash to advances in civil rights for African Americans. So that happens in 63, 1964, before these acts are passed. There's a primary, and George Wallace, the governor of Alabama,
Hmm.
does surprisingly well I mean, he doesn't win, but does well in Indiana. And we find out later on, in 68, when he runs, he does well in a number of northern cities, and he's getting support not just from Southern white Democrats who had always opposed civil
Hmm.
rights, but from Northern white, sometimes Democrats as well, sometimes working class. It's not always about class, but the the research would suggest that white working class ethnic people, Poles, uh, Irish Americans, Italian Americans, not Jewish Americans, however, but were generally worried about what equality would mean. So
Hmm.
the passage of the passage of these laws was supported and was upheld by the courts, but there was a growing, unhappiness among some white people about that, and that unhappiness when you had a politician like Nixon and then
Hmm.
later on Reagan, able to say, "Oh, we can maybe get the white Republicans and then maybe some of these white Northern people who used to be Democrats and were working class and are maybe say union members, we can kind of peel those off and try and appeal on the basis of race, right?
Hmm.
Now it wasn't everything that both Nixon and Reagan were talking about, but it was a factor, and so like that is identified as like, oh, maybe the first white backlash that was described as such.
Hmm.
Um, but
Were
when
there any others before that time too?
Oh, well, I mean, not given that name of white backlash,
Hmm.
but I would say so that one of the good things about working in these large projects, large biographical projects, is you begin at the beginning to some extent, you find individuals who are living from the very first days that America was founded, and you find that really from the very beginning, as soon as you see potential advances by African American people, then it will create a backlash. So if you go back to the very beginning in 1600 in Virginia, and just to take an example, I mean, so slavery wasn't set in stone. Racial slavery, as it then became known in the 18th and 19th century up until abolition, was a process. And initially, it seemed like, well, maybe it could be that if an African person, let's say an African woman, or an African American man converted to Christianity, well, maybe we can't make them slaves because if you're a Christian in England, you certainly can't be a slave, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
So why would they be different here? And so there's that issue. And then if an enslaved person has a child, what about that child? So
Hmm.
there's a case, and this is one of these early biographies that I worked on, and I have to credit Evelyn's husband, who sadly died in about 1998 or so. But he had worked did a major study of the colonial laws of Virginia, and so this woman named Elizabeth Key, who was enslaved, it seemed, and she had a child with a white man, and she sued for freedom, not from the man, but she sued for freedom for herself and for her child, uh, based on the fact that the father was white, so therefore the child and free, so the child should be free.
That's
Uh,
amazing. She sued. And what year was that again?
I think it was 1651, and she won her
And she
case.
won. And I've never heard that story before.
So she won the case, and she gets her freedom. And now you could ask, what are the reasons? Maybe the husband, the father, was an important, prominent person, but still, she sued, and there is now a precedent that people can gain their freedom either through being born to somebody
Hmm.
who's free and white, or by converting to Christianity. Um, but then by the 1670s and 1680s, you start to see new laws being passed that make sure that this doesn't happen again. That,
Again, right. Hmm.
I mean, I'm sure it happened in a couple of other. We're talking about tiny populations of like a couple of thousand in
Hmm.
Virginia at this time, but laws are passed that say no, uh, being a Christian should not be a barrier to being enslaved. So that one's out the window. And the other one is that in terms of being born to somebody, the status that is important is not the status of the father, as it was in England, but the status of the mother. So if you are born to an enslaved woman, you're enslaved too. So it's
Hmm.
lifetime
Right.
slave.
And so basically, so the slave masters could take advantage and rape the slaves and make sure they kept having slaves, you
Right.
know?
And
So,
and, and that there is that little moment of hope. And you see it in other cases. I mean, so there's another case, 1640, and I'm blanking on the names, but there were three men who were all uh, described as servants. Uh,
hmm.
and
Hmm.
one was a Negro called John Punch. One was a Scotsman called James Gregory, and one was a Dutchman called Victor. So they ran away, they get caught, they come back, and they all get a similar punishment of being whipped a certain amount of strokes, all the same. And then the Scotsman and the Dutchman have to do extra, like maybe it's I think a year extra work
Mhm.
for their servitude. But for the Negro John Punch, he then is, it says he has to serve the rest of his life as a slave.
Mm.
So you see these little examples early on of, I guess, interracial cooperation. These three men had much more in common than they did with the person who owned them. They help
Mm-hmm.
each other to escape. But if you set up a legal system and a society where, there are different punishments for black and white, which is what they spent the next 100 and
100, yeah, some 50 years, I guess, yeah,
yeah.
doing.
So you can see from the very beginning, um, if there is a black advance and it's seen to be threatening white supremacy, then there will be a counter reaction, and so
Right.
that and not to go with too many, you kind of see it after the revolution. Um, Slavery remains in the South, but in northern states where it's much less significant, it ends. But I think what you also see, and this is something in the dictionary project that we're seeing, uh,
Hmm.
you're seeing you see in the North a big increase in explicit racism with, for example, like this is when the N-word really
Hmm.
takes off.
Hmm.
Um, and so it's like, okay, so blacks are free now in the North, but let's not make sure that they're equally, equal to
Hmm.
white. So sort of a backlash. You see that, but really the main place where you see it is, of course, in Reconstruction after the Civil War, when for the first time African American men can vote. And so
Hmm.
that is extremely significant in states like, oh, it's significant all over, but in
All
states,
over, yeah. It was massacres everywhere,
yeah,
It was a huge backlash and very much, I would say, so open because you have the white liners who weren't behind, hiding behind the masks and the robes of the KKK, but they were just all out in the open, killing. So,
so all of this is known, and it's in the newspapers, and so like the fact that black people are in power, they actually have power and are winning. Now, there's never a state in which a majority of the legislators are black, but there are two states, Mississippi and South Carolina, where uh, most of the population is black. And so you do get significant numbers of African American legislatures, people like Peter Crosby, he was a sheriff. So you also, and that's the other thing that's fascinating about Reconstruction is you have sheriffs, you have local officials who are African American.
lieutenant
Um,
governors, even like governors, even though temporarily sometimes, but yeah, you had black people really in power.
right. And it's like the Secretary of Education in South Carolina was African American.
Hmm.
So yeah, so you do have, and the laws are changing. In it's I've been doing this for a long time, and you just keep on finding new things again and again. One of the things we were looking at in Mississippi, or I was looking at in Mississippi, was interracial marriage, right?
Hmm.
Which in Mississippi, in the 1870s, was legal.
Hmm.
It was dangerous. It it was it was
Straight
it
up
was
dangerous, but it was legal.
it was but the court, yeah, it was dangerous if you were a black man and a white woman, rather than the other way around. Having said that, it was legal, and the courts accepted that this was something, at least for a short period of time in the 1870s, um, that was allowed uh, in the South, and really at the same time when in other states. it wasn't allowed. Anyway,
Hmm.
but the courts in the South interpreted that yes, of course, because of the 14th Amendment, equal protection, there should be no racial distinctions in whether in marriages.
Hmm.
Uh, but so with African Americans show having political power, with this kind of direct threat to, even though there weren't many cases of it, but this direct threat to, I guess, white male supremacy with that, then you get the backlash. And so, yes, you have tanks and the equivalent of outside polling stations in 1875. They don't need to fire a shot. They just need to say, well, if we see black people going in to vote, maybe that'll go off. There are assassinations.
Hmm.
Charles Caldwell, somebody in Mississippi that I've looked at, and Dee Baldwin is the person who connected us. I
Yes,
found,
Adie Ball,
thank
and
you,
yes, the
thank you,
librarian in Mississippi. Yes. Hmm.
library in Mississippi, who has done a wonderful job in recreating the lives of African American legislatures. So
Yeah.
definitely, I need to credit her there. So um, because of the violence, because of these assassinations, because many African Americans and white allies are afraid, because there are always some white allies,
Hmm.
are afraid to vote. Um, Eventually, by 1875, 76, Reconstruction seems to be on the outs. The federal government doesn't support it, and so it kind of ends with in 1876.
Right. And then launches us into Jim Crow, which
And what
lasted for almost 100 years,
yeah,
pretty much.
but black people still vote. So this is
Hmm.
the other thing, is that still there are still pockets of black people voting in Mississippi and North Carolina. And in North Carolina, you get alliances between white and black workers. Um, and in 1898, there's a coup d'etat in Wilmington, North Carolina, to prevent a interracial coalition from being in power. So slowly, yeah, all of the gains of Reconstruction are taken away.
Hmm.
So that, I mean, there's definitely, this is the number one case of a white backlash to African American power. Uh,
Hmm. Yeah.
and I think both the facts of Reconstruction and what black people were able to do, and in terms of expanding education for everyone, for black and white,
Hmm.
that's not really known, and the violence that ended it isn't really known. Um, Having said that, it's a lot better known now than it
Hmm.
was, say, 30 or 40 years ago. And we have books and we have websites, and maybe they won't be there forever. But I think that one of the concerns that we have right now, bringing it back to right now,
Hmm.
is this attack on uh, websites in the military that are commemorating African American soldiers and being taken down. And
Right.
is this like in Reconstruction, when there are no black newspapers, the ones that are there are destroyed, and it takes a long time for them to get back up again. I think the genie's out of the ball. This is maybe me being optimistic. I
Hmm.
think there's too many projects like the one that we work on for the African American National Biography. There's just too much information out there about what has happened in the past, the
Hmm.
history of race relations in this country, that they're not going to be able to stop.
Right. That's our hope for sure.
That's that's our
By the
that's
work that
our,
you're doing, and the stuff that I'm doing too, and there's so many organizations that are really making sure that this history does not get destroyed and erased, and then have to dig it up back again because we've had a backlash.
right,
So
right,
it's really important for all of us, and to make sure, even just people who are parents, tell your children about it. Because
right.
one anything like I wrote a piece about Oscar Dunn, who was the lieutenant governor of Louisiana and then governor for a short time. I think it was his great nephew remembered the story that his grandmother told him about him because it wasn't in the history books. And
Right.
so it set him up to actually go ahead and start telling that story because he was told his teachers about what my great great uncle, or I'm probably misquoting like the lineage, but basically my relative was lieutenant governor, then governor. And the
Right.
teacher said to him, there was never been a black, lieutenant governor or governor of Louisiana. And actually ended up being two because it was a PBS pinchback and Oscar, Dunn. So it's important for, the elders to also tell, keep the stories alive. So, and I think we've covered so many things already. But let me just review some of my other questions that I had. And if you have anything in addition to say about those, I wanted to go into like, how has the presence of Black political leaders historically triggered white supremacist movements in the United States? You've kind of talked about it a little bit already, but do you have anything else to say on that?
I guess the only thing that is what's different is really what I wanted to focus on. Like, so how is Reconstruction? So, how is the backlash to Reconstruction different from, let's say, that backlash that we're talking about in the 1960s and the present moment? So, if you just take these three uh, periods, I'd say the one good thing so far is that what we're not seeing is the extreme violence of the Reconstruction era and of the
Hmm.
decade
Yeah.
that
Thank
I,
God.
I'm not going to say it can't happen now or it can't happen here, but I mean, just to be realistic, we're not dealing with that situation yet, and I don't know what would get us there. But the main thing is, we're not dealing with that overarching sense of violence and violence with impunity where any white man could kill a black man
Hmm.
with impunity, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
So we don't have that situation. Uh, One of the things that's interesting, though, I think, is that in the 60s backlash, to some extent, yes, it was successful in that it elected Richard Nixon, and you could say it maybe helped to elect Ronald Reagan as well by, moving racist white votes from the North and the South into one part of the Republican column, although still in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, there were, many Republicans who supported civil rights.
Hmm.
And for example, both Reagan and George W. Bush passed the Voting Rights Act extension in the 1980s and in 2000s. Um, so there's a difference there. And I think one of the differences is that the courts uh, in the 60s were still on the side of integration, we're still on the side of civil rights. And so if you had the Supreme Court and lower federal courts supporting equal rights, um, that kind of limits what the backlash might be. So, one exception, affirmative action, is Supreme Court in 1978. And the Bakke decision says, no, well, we can't really have a racially based affirmative action. So there's maybe a slight moving back, slight in
Hmm.
the sense of this is maybe not moving quite as quickly as we would have hoped in the 1960s.
Hmm.
But in general, the courts, the media, the mainstream press, the three news networks, as there were in those,
Right. Hmm.
um, were generally, I would say, were generally supportive of the same process.
Hmm.
So there's always like two coalitions going on. So the pro civil rights or pro equality coalition did have, it would seem to me, much of the establishment, the courts, the media on that side.
Hmm.
And the concern is, well, we're in a totally different situation now, right?
Hmm.
So the bulwarks against the white backlash that happened after the 60s are kind of gone because, first of all, the courts are no longer, as especially the Supreme Court, are no longer reliable to uphold equal rights.
Hmm.
The Supreme Court certainly does not. And the media, well, everybody's got their own media, right? So
Right.
so we're not all watching CBS
Hmm.
and we're listening to whatever we want to hear. So that is a huge change, a huge distinction between that 60s backlash and the one that we're dealing with now.
Yeah. And I have a whole bunch of other questions, but I wanted to touch on what you were just saying because with the current climate, um, how do we come together to, like people, to recognize that race has been a big part of, political backlashes and because of, some white supremacists, their, belief system. How do all people that don't believe what those folks, say, how do we move forward? How do we come together and make sure that we still have equal rights for all? So,
Uh, Now you're asking the difficult questions, which I don't know if that I really have the answers
yeah.
to. Um,
But in your opinion, what,
I well, I think fundamentally, I think this is a feeling based on living whatever it is, 59 years almost on this planet, is that there's more of us than there
hmm
are of them. And by
yeah.
us, I mean people who generally want to give everybody else a fair shake, who don't believe that anything as silly as the color of your skin or your gender, or that any of those things should be things that are distinctions, or that some people are more deserving of rights or money or whatever than others.
hmm
So I think there's more of us
hmm
than there are of them who want to keep everything for themselves and believe that other people are inferior based on race or gender or whatever. Uh, and the problem is that there's a significant, if now we're talking about Trump,
hmm
there's a significant number of support, and this is not all about race, but there's a significant number of his supporters who would think the same thing. They say, "Oh, we do believe in equality,
hmm
right? We just don't believe in special rights, and so we don't believe in DEI."
hmm
Um, and I think it's
That's
just
because they don't, sorry to cut you off, but I feel that they don't understand the reason why it was put in place and is still in place today.
right. They don't understand the history.
Right. Hmm.
So yeah. So one of the things that we've got to keep on telling the history every time they take a website down that tells the story that we know is true, that we need to, in some other venue, put it back up there. But it's like getting back to those 17th century three guys who ran away together,
Hmm.
escaped, ran away from their master, the Scotsman, the Dutchman, and the Negro. They felt they had something in common with each
hmm
other
hmm
that they did not have in common with their master, right? And so it's like, how do you persuade the Trump voters, for want of a better word, or even more importantly, the people who don't vote at all?
Right. Because that's another reason why I started this because I have found out that almost 90 million eligible voters did not vote in this last election. And that's
Right.
just so disheartening. So,
It certainly is. So and so that's but then one of the things that we need to fight against is, and it's surprising that we haven't heard much about this yet, of all the different actions that have been taken in this, how long has it been president? 6 weeks or 8 weeks or whatever.
hmm
Nobody's been talking about voting rights, but it would seem to me that that's the one thing that we need to be really careful about, because given the Supreme Court is inclined to support Trump on
voting
that.
rights. Right. Yeah.
Um,
Equality.
yeah.
Yeah.
So I no, so I worry that the Supreme Court is not going to help us in this situation. So we're going to have to fight in the lower courts, maybe, and maybe that will
Mhm.
be successful. Maybe something at the political level, but I have my deep doubts and concerns that in the next 2 years that say the Democrats would be able to retake the House or retake the Senate. I mean, that is the minimum that needs to be done to start, defeating this
Right. Yeah.
because that's 4 years. I
Hmm.
just thought it was
Right. No,
so yeah. So
I hear you.
that's that's kind of depressing. But
Right.
I think if we can get people to, you know, what are their common values, you
Hmm.
would think something like healthcare. If there were a tax on healthcare and people lose, what is called Obamacare,
Hmm.
I think that would.
Right, yeah. And,
But
I have someone coming on later to discuss the importance of being involved with your state and local governments. And
right,
because a lot of people aren't trusting things at the federal level.
yeah.
And it's so important to really get involved in your state and local to, you know, at least support the values that you have and what your beliefs and what you want to happen,
Right.
and just do it at the state level. So,
Yeah, states' rights for I mean, and that I think is absolutely true about what it gives me a big concern that okay, does that then just mean we're leaving people who are in, let's say Mississippi, Alabama, South Carolina,
mhm.
many of whom are African American, many of whom are poor whites, and we're just saying, oh well, too bad, you know?
Hmm.
So I mean, like, yes, to some extent, yes, there can be in New York and California and Pennsylvania, maybe not
Hmm.
Pennsylvania, New York, California, Illinois, uh,
Hmm.
you can do things at the state level that is going to make sure that not everybody is going to be affected by this. But I think we don't want to lose sight of the fact that in the rest of America, we need to be fighting for everybody there as well.
Exactly, exactly. And I hope that enough people, like you were saying, you feel like there's more people that really care about others and not a part of the necessarily the white supremacist group, that that we all help each other in some way, that we figure it out and yeah, it is basically we've got to join together and hopefully unify. And that's why I'm doing this particular show is so
Yeah.
that we can explore, other, avenues, understand our history of where we came from and why things are this way and how we can, learn from it and then come together, because now we're better informed. Because one thing too that I'm discussing with some folks, they don't even really understand how the government works. And that was another reason why I started this, not only because of the almost 90 million people that didn't vote, but if you don't really even know how the government works, you don't even understand your participation and how you are to be a citizen here and how involved you should be in order to keep things moving, at least in the direction that you would like it to move. So let's get back to this talk about. So I had another question, but again, you may have already kind of addressed this as well. But how did white resistance manifest after landmark elections like Barack Obama's presidency or other significant Black political movements?
So the interesting thing about Obama, I guess, or at least between the, that Obama is replaced by Trump. I mean that, and the significant numbers of people who voted for Barack Obama, and
Significant. I think some of the even the people that ended up voting for Trump had voted for Barack Obama.
that's
Hmm.
what I mean.
Yeah.
Somebody can in their head figure,
Hmm.
oh yeah, I think this guy was worth it, and I don't have a problem if he's got a funny name and is black.
Hmm.
Uh, um, I'll vote for him. And then in the same, 4 years later, say, oh, well, but then this guy who's saying that Barack Obama wasn't even a citizen of the
Hmm.
United States, I'll vote for him. So I guess I think that's the part that many people can't get there. It seems so irrational.
Hmm. Hmm.
But in their minds, they were saying no, no, well, the last one didn't work, and I don't like Hillary or I don't like Kamala. Uh,
Hmm.
so definitely there's a whole big amount of sexism in there as well. um, I'll vote for Trump. Um, but I think my problem in understanding this is that I kept on seeing the progress.
Mm-hmm.
If you're beginning in 1600 and you're following all the way through, and especially if you're looking at from 1960 uh, right up to the election of Barack Obama, you think, oh, that's just amazing progress that has been made. Obviously, there's still extreme white racism in the country. You're maybe never going to get rid of that, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But I underestimated how much there was and how willing people were, and this is not just entirely about race, but
Mm-hmm.
willing people were to say, I don't actually care about democracy, actually, because that's what it's coming down to is
Right. Yeah.
we, we're not going to pay attention to what judges say. We're going to try and keep the right to vote from people who, of course, should have the
Mm-hmm.
right to vote.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess that's one of my concerns about how I've been thinking about this was that I wasn't seeing enough of the clues
Mm-hmm.
uh, then, um, and perhaps it was just maybe people were doing a good job of keeping it quiet, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or is that, oh yeah, of course I believe in equality, but they weren't thinking too hard about it. And then so uh, you know if people are if immigrants are excluded on the basis of where they come from, if they're Muslims or if they come from certain countries that are not like the country I came from.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I've gone through the immigration process. I've never had a problem
Mm-hmm.
with
Yeah.
with with it, and I wonder why that is, right?
Right.
So I, yeah, so I think, my concern is that I underestimated how powerful that was at the
Mm-hmm.
time.
Right, because for people
Maybe a
to
lot of
completely
people.
ignore the signs, I mean, for me, even though there are, plenty of people that are black and, and other minorities that did vote for him. But for me, I know seeing, and I've been trying to keep this nonpartisan, but again, this to me is about humanity. And when I see someone and see other people going for someone that, clearly does not have my best interest as a
Mhm.
black person in America. Um, I just question when you see someone like that, it doesn't have the interest of other minorities. Why do you overlook it? Why do you think, oh, it's no big deal? You know, is it all about money? You think that person is going to fill your pockets, or you're just not, you're so detached from what we go through as minorities in this country, and it just doesn't matter for you. So that's one thing that one of many things I've been
Yeah,
grappling with.
right.
So, but what role has media and political rhetoric played, in these backlashes, do you feel?
Well, um, I mean, I think I did touch on this a little bit earlier, but I
Mhm.
think that the media landscape in these three different time periods is so different. So if you look at Reconstruction, one of the first things to think about is that you've got an entire population of African Americans in the South, almost all of whom are illiterate. Right. So there is no media landscape. I mean, media is, person to person, and
Mm-hmm.
you eventually get some black newspapers, but the mainstream white press overwhelmingly telling people who can read
Mm-hmm.
what they need to know. Um, so the media is quite different there as opposed to like in the 1960s where you have this, a fairly strong national media,
Mm-hmm.
newspapers and the television stations and radio that is um, relatively in the center,
Mm-hmm.
but certainly feels like it's not going to encourage the white backlash, I
Mm-hmm.
think. So tries to understand it. Um, but now, here in the 21st century, as I say, you've got your own media, so you don't need to pay attention to whatever the consensus is, right?
Mm-hmm.
There is no consensus anymore. It's only a consensus of um, at least two forms. One, the Trump worldview and the worldview that thinks that's crazy or that is not
Mm-hmm.
gonna that's not good for the country.
Mm-hmm.
So the media landscapes are different. Um, and what the other one was about political leadership.
Or the
Rhetoric.
rhetoric that played into their play into it. I mean, we see basically, I mean, throughout history, there's always been propaganda, right? And when I look in the newspapers from the 1800s,
Uh-huh.
boy, it's really in your face there. It's full of propaganda, and I'm so saddened that we don't have as many black newspapers available for us to look at because they destroyed them. They were destroyed by, white supremacists, and so. But when I look at the all the newspapers that we still do have access to from back in those days, it's full of propaganda. Um,
I mean, yeah, that is true. I mean, that is true. And they become and so what is interesting is right is that that becomes the only source. So looking at Mississippi and Reconstruction,
hmm
and looking at the kind of violence that we are seeing, you go on Google now in 2025, and the first thing that will pop up will be a report from a white supremacist newspaper in Mississippi about the Clinton riot in Mississippi in 1875,
hmm
which is essentially an attack by white people on African Americans. Several were killed. Um, so that is what is still out there because those newspapers were able to survive. Uh,
hmm
it brings it to the top of the Google list.
hmm
I have to say though that the amount of, again, this is work that's been done in the past 20 or 30 years. In the old, when I started studying African American history, you'd go load up the microfilm onto it,
hmm
crank through
Crank
it,
it. Yep. Click
they
through.
get through,
hmm
you get distracted by, and that was where I learned like so much stuff because black newspapers covered the entirety of the African American experience. So the sports were different, the music was different, the entertainment was different, the social scene was
hmm
different, and there were and they were and they were extremely well written and all of that, all of the 20th century black newspapers, or a lot of them, are available now. You can get them. Unfortunately, only certain libraries give you access to it, and so like
Right. hmm
one dream it would be that the newspapers and sources that are available to me, because I happen to be lucky to work at a place, Harvard, that has those, that everybody could, they're not going to do that. But
Yeah. But I
are,
wish they would because, even when I do my own research, I always come up against the wall to
Mhm.
not be able to dig further because I'm not, a teacher. I'm not someone part of the college, system, scholastic system.
but having said that, there are still some public libraries that you can go to and access some of these newspapers. So, um, yeah, I mean, like there's a whole world out there that is available that tells you about what life was like. Uh,
hmm
Certainly in the 20th century, but even some of the late 19th century papers as well, the ones that have survived.
hmm
So I'd say, you know, that's something else that needs to be done, making sure that these sources that tell historians what they need to know to write their stories should be open to everybody. And maybe if everybody had a chance to look at them, that's wishful thinking, I think. But if everybody had a chance to look at them, they would say, "Oh, this is actually a it's not all about it's not all about oh terrible things that happened during segregation and lynching, although those things are all covered, it's like, this is what,
They were living their lives, it shows the whole
yeah,
element of, of living during, those time periods.
right.
So it wasn't just all written about the horrible things that happened, you know? So, yeah.
So yeah, so yeah, I think each political era, has different media covering it, and so they have, so I think we see different things there. Uh,
hmm Yeah. We kind of touched on this a little bit earlier too when we were talking about why certain people who voted for Barack and then went to this route now. But overall, in general, I wanted to ask, what were the factors that persuaded, white people to sometimes not see common cause with non-whites? And that's what I was saying, like, when you did vote for Barack, but then you
yeah.
went this other way. And did you not see any common denominators of what we all need?
I don't know what these individual people were thinking, but I think they just thought, well, perhaps we do have a common cause, but what concerns me more right now is that maybe this is how they perceive it. If I look at uh, my television set, when I was looking at it in the 1970s, there were okay, maybe there were a couple of black TV shows, but that was it. And their perception is now, oh, well, this is the whites are a minority. But none of this is true. But it's a perception. I think.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's that perception that if African American and other people of color are advancing and doing well, then that must mean that white people are not doing as well. Like,
Mm-hmm.
is that
So it's
perception?
like pitting one against the other instead of realizing that, hey, we have common threads here and we can
That
come
there-
together.
Absolutely, and that there could be governmental programs that help everybody, like a healthcare system. I mean, just the other day I was dealing with um, a healthcare issue and just looking at the different prices on one part of my plan and the other, and I was thinking, I mean, I grew up in a society where healthcare is a right.
Mm-hmm.
So I've always been a little bit annoyed about this, but this, to some extent, this didn't start with all of this was the case in the 80s and 90s.
Right. Yeah. No, it's
It
the
didn't
healthcare
start with
issue has been
Trump.
a problem for quite some time,
But
so.
there are things that can unite people.
Mm-hmm.
And you would think that, we're all getting old, we're all going to
Mm-hmm.
get older, and then there's this huge demographic bump of people, of the baby boomers who are already going to be in their 80s,
Mm-hmm.
90s, and requiring more and more and more things. How do you pay for that? It's something who looks after the people who are, these are the things that we should be talking about. These are
Mm-hmm.
the things that unite us.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Um, but we're not because we're talking about the present day and the issues that somehow by, removing photographs of the Tuskegee Airmen from uh, the US military site, that is somehow advancing um, the country, you know?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's like you need to remember and acknowledge these feats, so then you can have a better understanding, a fuller understanding of, contributions in this country and not create a narrative where it's just, white only and white only whites have done well and are worthy of being here. What steps do you think can be taken to, address or, and dismantle, the cycle of backlash?
I don't know. I think maybe what we can do is make it's maybe there's always going to be a pendulum swinging back and forth, and then maybe in some areas there will be, oh, we're a little bit more open to everybody working together, and maybe in other areas it'll be, well, for whatever reason it is, maybe race or maybe language or immigration or whatever, that maybe we're not going to be quite as much. But the, I mean, the divide at the moment is so hostile and bitter uh,
Hmm.
and hasn't been seen since Reconstruction.
That's a huge statement because we also, we went through the 60s, which was very tumultuous,
Yeah,
but
and okay, so maybe
but
maybe,
I'm not backing down on it. I'm just
but
saying that is really a strong reality
yeah,
to really compare because that but I see it though based on what I've studied and learned from
yeah,
Reconstruction. I can
yeah.
definitely see the parallels for sure. you know? So, but hopefully
Uh,
it won't get, as you were mentioning before, won't get to the violence of the Reconstruction era because that was we lost so many lives were lost during that time that people just don't talk about. There were many massacres, which they call race riots, but it really was, massacres um, of people wanting to keep Black people out of power. So, um, but any final thoughts on this subject?
oh, just to thank you for. I mean, I'm really looking forward to hearing all the other people that you
Yeah.
have. And I think you absolutely you mentioned the importance of civics and that
Hmm.
idea of understanding how government works because I don't think people do understand
Hmm.
how it's worked, how it works, or and I don't know if that's like a something that America has always been
It
not
really wasn't. That's one thing that I'm exploring with some of the experts. There, because when I was growing up, civics was very important. I'm a kid of the 70s. It was
right.
very important. And then we've gone through a period of time where, um, because they couldn't decide what to teach civically,
Yeah.
things pretty much fell by the wayside. There's a resurgence of civics,
Uh-huh.
of learning civics now, but for the people who are voting right now, there's a big group, I would say, and I don't quote me for sure on this, but based on what I have heard, and talking to people too who are like in their 30s or 20s, they really don't understand how the government works. And again, that's one of the reasons why I'm doing this is so that I can bring on people from different civic organizations to explain how the government works and also for them to learn how to be a citizen. There was this gentleman, Eric Liu, who I believe he's the CEO of not iCivics. I can't remember the organization, but I heard him on a podcast, and he really walked through with one person how to be a citizen. And for me, when I listened to him talk about it, citizen wasn't, I didn't look at it as a noun anymore. I looked at it as a verb, as an action, as being an actionable person, being involved in your country, in your state, and and it's just not something that just because you're born here or even if you came over immigrated here, um it's it's such a bigger picture is that should be a part of our lifestyles of living here in this country, clearly. And I think once people or I believe or I hope that once people really get that, they we will come together because under the Constitution it has it all there about equality, um, um, keeping separation of church and state.
Yeah.
It's all there. Freedom of speech, freedom of press. It
Right.
is there, and if people really understood and took to heart what it actually says for both people who are just everyday citizens or lawmakers, let's really enforce what the Constitution actually says. And if we live by that, then we can really come together. So,
Well, I hope so.
yep,
And
I hope so too. Fingers crossed. So thank you so much for being here, but tell people where they can find you, support your work, and
Well, I mean, like, so I work, as I say, I work on a number of projects. So so the large biographical dictionaries, the African American National Biography and the others, which in total is 11,000. Biographies are all, I mean, they're all available, but very expensive if you buy them in, this row of books.
Mhm.
But they're available online through the African American Studies Center at Oxford University Press. And the problem is that only you can usually only get those through universities, but maybe some public libraries will have them. However,
Mhm.
one of the spin-off projects that we're doing, the enslaved.org, which looks at biographies of slavery, is so it's on enslaved, enslaved.org. And the biographies that are there, along with data sets about slavery and enslaved people. So the biographies come from our projects from the dictionaries. So that's open to the public. It's totally free, and I think you would learn a lot there. Um, so that would be the main place I would suggest to go, and hopefully one of these days, you know, places like Harvard will open up their library holdings in their online catalog and let everybody who wants
Yes,
to read it, you know?
right. That would be wonderful, especially in these times, for
Yeah.
sure, you know? So,
And I believe that my little book, my little
mhm.
biography is available still for like $2 or something uh, on Amazon. I believe that there's a version you can, an online version of it as well.
Cool.
So, uh, so that would be there. But yeah, enslaved.org is a very interesting project, and I think eventually it's at an early stage, but eventually it will be of significant value for people doing genealogical work.
Hmm.
So, but
Wonderful.
it takes a while before you build up all the different sources of different, so it could be a list of enslaved people on a plantation. It could be a list of political office holders who were African American, who had formerly been slaves, that kind of thing.
Hmm.
So just, check out the website, read the stories, and hopefully you'll learn.
Great. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Stephen. I'm so
Yeah,
happy that you came on board and I really enjoyed talking to you.
it's always great talking to you. Okay.